I never imagined I'd be standing there, watching my husband and my best friend exchange vows in front of me. But there I was, my hands trembling, a lump in my throat, as the person I had trusted most in the world broke me in the most public and painful way. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Not in a million years. I had spent 16 years building a life with Braxton, and this was the very last thing I expected. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I was numb, barely aware of the well-dressed guests around me. Their polite smiles turned to curious glances. The wedding was beautiful, too beautiful. The kind of wedding you see in movies where everything looks perfect, yet underneath, something was horribly, horribly wrong. Do you, Braxton, take Caitlin to be your lawfully wedded wife? My husband's voice, clear and confident, echoed through the church, making my heart drop. He was supposed to be mine. He had always been mine, but standing there, watching him declare his love for someone else, someone who I had considered my closest confidant, was a betrayal I couldn't have predicted, even in my worst nightmares. I thought back to the days before everything changed, to the happy years we had together, when I believed Braxton was my rock, but that was before I started noticing the small things, the way he became distant, the late nights at work that never seemed to end, the whispered phone calls when he thought I wasn't listening. It wasn't the big things at first. It never is. It was the quiet shifts, the sudden disconnects, that started unraveling the fabric of our once perfect life. I had no idea what was happening, but deep down, I knew something was off. I had started questioning him, asking about the late hours, the secretive behavior, but he would always brush it off with a dismissive laugh. "You're just being paranoid, Zephyr," he'd say. "I'm working hard for us, for our future." And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But standing there, looking at the two of them, watching my best friend slip into the role of the woman he was choosing to spend the rest of his life with, the truth finally hit me. All the signs, all the suspicions came rushing back, and it was like I had been punched in the gut. My world was crumbling, and it was all because of them. The pain was suffocating, but there was also something else bubbling inside of me, something stronger than the hurt. It was anger, fury even. How dare they do this to me? To us? How could they betray me like this right under my nose? And worse, how could I have been so blind to it all? I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a reality I couldn't escape. But one thing was certain, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not after everything they had taken from me. As the ceremony continued, I couldn't hear a word being said. My mind was racing, thinking back on everything that led me here. 16 years of my life were spent with someone who had promised to love and cherish me, only to end up here, in the most humiliating moment of my life. And Caitlin, my best friend, the one person I thought I could trust. She had always been there for me, or so I thought. But now I realized how wrong I had been. The look in her eyes as she stood beside Braxton, her hand in his, her smile too wide, too knowing, it made my blood run cold. How long had they been planning this? How long had they been deceiving me? And why? What had I done to deserve this? I could feel the tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of them. They didn't deserve to see me cry. Not when they were the ones who had betrayed me. The vows continued, but I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was already plotting my next move. They had no idea what was coming. They thought they had won. They thought they could break me, humiliate me, and take everything from me. But they were wrong. As Braxton and Caitlin sealed their vows with a kiss, I made my decision. I would get revenge. I would make them pay for what they had done to me. This wasn't just about a cheating husband or a backstabbing friend. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my life, and my future. I left the church quietly, unnoticed by the crowd, my mind set on what I had to do next. There was no going back. I would expose them both for what they were, and I would make sure the truth came to light, no matter the cost. The game had just begun, and I wasn't going to lose. For the first time in years, I woke up feeling the weight of my own thoughts, heavy and suffocating. The wedding, Braxton and Caitlin's wedding, kept replaying in my mind. It wasn't just the image of them standing there, exchanging vows that haunted me. It was the realization of how long they had been deceiving me, how deeply they had buried their betrayal under layers of lies. and how much I had ignored because I wanted to believe in the life I had built with Braxton. I couldn't focus on the day ahead. Every task felt trivial in comparison to the storm brewing inside of me, but I had no choice. I had to face the reality of what had happened. I couldn't just walk away from everything without a plan. I needed answers, and most importantly, I needed control back. The day after the wedding, Braxton acted as if nothing had changed. He came home from his honeymoon with Caitlin, wearing the same tired smile he always wore. He had his arm around her in a way that made my stomach twist, and for the first time, I noticed the subtle, almost smug look in his eyes. He thought I didn't know. He thought I couldn't see through his lies, but I did. "Hey, Zephyr, how are you holding up?" he asked, the words dripping with a false sense of concern. His voice was as smooth as it had always been, the kind of voice that used to comfort me. But now it felt hollow, empty. I looked at him, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to tell him everything I had discovered, but I kept quiet. I had to stay calm. I had to be strategic. If I confronted him head-on, he'd deny everything, twist the truth, and I'd end up looking irrational one. No, I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. I spent the next few days meticulously going through everything I could find. His phone, his emails, anything that could expose their lies. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. The secret bank accounts, the trips they'd taken together under the guise of business meetings, the late-night phone calls, the hotel receipts, all traces of a life Braxton had built without me, all funded by the money that was supposed to be ours. But what struck me the hardest was when I found the emails between Braxton and Caitlin. They had been planning their future together for months, talking about the house they'd buy, the vacations they'd take. It was as if I didn't exist in their world anymore. I had been the fool, trusting them, believing in the lies they'd spun for so long. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. How could I have been so blind? How did I let this go on for so long? Braxton had always been charming, always the center of attention, but I never thought he would turn on me like this. And Caitlin, my best friend, the one person I trusted more than anyone. How could she betray me like that? How could she lie to my face, pretend to be my friend, while all along she was scheming with my husband? I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. There it was, the final confirmation of what I had suspected all along. I wasn't just the victim of a cheating husband. I was the victim of a well-orchestrated plot, a betrayal so deep that it shook me to my core, but I couldn't let it consume me. I wouldn't let it. I had a plan, and I was going to make them pay for what they had done. I couldn't let Braxton think he could walk all over me, that he could take everything from me without facing the consequences. The next morning, I decided it was time to confront him. But this time, it would be different. This time, I wouldn't be the naive wife who stood by while her husband tore their life apart. I was done being the victim. I was done letting Braxton and Caitlin think they had all the power. I called him into the living room, my heart racing with anticipation. I had all the proof I needed. The bank statements, the emails, the photos, everything. I was ready. He walked in, his usual swagger in place, but there was a slight hesitation in his step when he saw the look on my face. "What's going on, Zephyr?" he asked, feigning ignorance, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew. "I know what you've been doing," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "I know about the bank accounts, the trips, and the life you've been building behind my back. I know about you and Caitlin." His face went pale, and for a split second, I saw the panic flash in his eyes, but then he quickly regained his composure, trying to brush it off with a chuckle. "You're just overreacting," he said, but the tremble in his voice gave him away. "There's nothing going on, Zephyr. You've got it all wrong." "No, Braxton," I said, my voice cold, cutting through the lies like a knife. "You've been lying to me for months. You've been using my money to fund your little secret life, and I'm done. It's over." I stood up, the divorce papers in my hand. I watched as his expression shifted from disbelief to anger. "You can't do this," he shouted, his face reddening. "You think you can just throw everything away because you're upset?" I didn't flinch. "I think you've already thrown everything away," I said, holding up the papers. "I'm done. I'm not going to be your fool anymore. And when this goes to court, your company will know what kind of man you really are." His eyes widened in panic. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I smiled coldly. "You'll see. We've got everything we need, and you're going to pay for what you've done." And just like that, the facade he had carefully built started to crumble. I stared at the divorce papers, the final proof of everything I had learned over the last few weeks. I had been living in a fog of confusion and hurt, but now everything was clear. Braxton had betrayed me in a way I never could have imagined. And Caitlin, my supposed best friend, had been a part of it all along. The anger inside me boiled over as I thought about the life they had built together, funded by the money I had worked so hard for. I needed to make sure they understood exactly what they had done, and more importantly, I needed to make sure they paid for it. I couldn't let them think they could just walk away unscathed. They had taken everything from me, but now it was my turn to take it back. I had no idea how long I had been sitting there, staring at the papers, but the sound of my phone ringing pulled me out of my thoughts. It was Braxton. "Zephyr, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. I could hear the tension beneath the surface, and I knew this conversation was coming. "I don't know what's going on, but you're overreacting. We can figure this out." I laughed bitterly, unable to stop myself. "Figure it out? You think there's something to figure out, Braxton? You've been lying to me for months. You've been spending my money on Caitlin and building a life behind my back. What else is there to figure out?" There was a long pause on the other end, and I could almost hear him trying to gather his thoughts. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand, Zephyr. I thought you wouldn't understand. Caitlin and I—" "Don't even say her name." I cut him off, my voice shaking with anger. "You've destroyed everything, Braxton. I trusted you. I gave up my career, my freedom, to be with you, and this is what you do to me? You think I'll just sit here and take it?" There was a shift in his tone, a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. "I didn't want to hurt you. You have to understand, I was under pressure. My mother—" "Your mother?" I scoffed. "She's the reason you treated me like this. She's the reason you lied, stole, and manipulated everything we had. Braxton, you're not the man I thought I married." I heard him take a deep breath, and for a moment, it seemed like he was going to try and justify his actions again. But instead, he said something that made my blood run cold. "You're just mad because you're losing everything. You're losing me, and you're losing the life you had. But you can't change that now. It's done." The finality in his words hit me harder than I expected. I had always feared the day he would stop pretending, but now that it had come, I wasn't sure how to respond. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to the silence between us. Then it hit me. I wasn't just mad. I was done. I was done with the lies, done with the manipulations, done with Braxton and Caitlin. I had spent too long questioning myself, wondering if I could ever make it on my own. But now I knew that the only way to find peace was to stand up for myself. I wasn't going to let them destroy me. "I'm not losing anything, Braxton," I said, my voice steady, "because I'm walking away from you. And when I go, I'm taking everything with me. You think this is over? You think you can just walk away without consequences? I have a plan, and I'm not backing down." I could hear him getting frustrated, but I didn't care. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising. "You'll regret it. You're throwing everything away." "Everything?" I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. "What do you think you've thrown away, Braxton? It's not just me you're losing. It's everything you've built on lies, manipulation, and betrayal. And you'll have to answer for it." I hung up the phone before he could say anything else. I was done listening to him. I didn't need his empty promises or his excuses. I had my own future to think about now, a future without him. The next few days were a blur of activity as I set my plan into motion. I contacted a lawyer and started gathering every piece of evidence I could. The bank statements, the emails, the hotel receipts, they were all part of the case I was building against Braxton and Caitlin. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this without facing the consequences. But as I dug deeper into the web they had woven, I found something even more disturbing. I had suspected that Braxton had been hiding things from me, but I never imagined he would go so far. He had been siphoning money from our joint account for months, using it to fund their secret trips and their new life together. But what shocked me even more was the realization that Caitlin had been in on it from the beginning. She wasn't just his accomplice. She had been using me for years, pretending to be my friend while manipulating me to get what she wanted. The anger that had been building inside of me for months finally erupted. I had been a fool, but now I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I knew what I had to do. I called Braxton again, but this time, my voice was cold and calculated. I have everything, Braxton. The proof, the bank statements, the emails. I'm taking this to court, and you will lose everything. There was a brief silence on the other end. You can't prove anything, he said, trying to sound confident, but I could hear the fear in his voice. I already have, I replied. And you won't get away with this? I'm not just walking away, Braxton. I'm making sure you pay for everything you've done. And with that, the power shifted. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was in control, and I wasn't going to let them tear me down any longer. The days that followed were filled with tension and anticipation as I prepared for the court battle. But I knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, I was going to win. Braxton and Caitlin were going to pay for everything, and I would finally be free. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. I had reclaimed my life. The days following my phone call with Braxton were tense. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man who had betrayed me. Every laugh he shared with his mother felt like a slap in the face. I no longer recognized him. He wasn't the man I had married. He had become someone else entirely, someone consumed by greed, deceit, and self-interest. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to be strategic, but the anger inside me grew, bubbling up like an uncontrollable force. I had spent too many years being quiet, tolerating his behavior, allowing myself to be manipulated. Now, I was done. It wasn't just Braxton that I had to deal with, it was Caitlin too. My supposed best friend, the one who had been there for me when I needed support, had turned on me. She had been more than just an accomplice in this betrayal. She had been a collaborator, a partner in crime, and someone I trusted with my deepest secrets. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the divorce papers when I got an unexpected message. It was from Caitlin. I hadn't heard from her in days, and I wasn't sure how to feel. Was she reaching out because she felt guilty? Was she trying to make amends? The message was short, to the point. We need to talk. I felt a surge of disgust, but I replied anyway. I was no longer interested in playing games. I had learned enough to know exactly what was happening, and I wasn't going to let Caitlin off the hook so easily. When we met the next day, Caitlin seemed anxious, as if she wasn't sure how to face me. She looked down at the table as I sat across from her, waiting for her to speak first. Zephyr, she started, her voice hesitant. I cut her off. Save it, Caitlin. Don't even pretend like you don't know what's going on. You've been sleeping with Braxton. You've been lying to me, using me. I'm done with your excuses. She winced at my words, her face flushing with embarrassment, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she looked away, guilt written all over her face. I'm sorry, Zephyr. I never meant for it to go this far. No, Caitlin. You did mean for it to go this far. You've been playing both sides this whole time. I trusted you, my best friend, the person I confided in, and you used that trust to stab me in the back. My voice cracked with emotion, but I refused to show weakness. I didn't know what else to do, she said, her voice breaking. I got in too deep, and Braxton, he promised me things. Promises? Promises to destroy my life? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You really think that justifies what you did? Caitlin's head drooped, and she whispered, I didn't know how to get out. Yeah, well, I'm not going to let you keep hurting me. Or Braxton. You've both made your choices, and now you'll have to face the consequences. She didn't respond immediately, but I could see her shoulders slump as if the weight of her actions was finally hitting her. I wasn't sure if she felt sorry for what she had done, or if she was just sorry she got caught. After a long, heavy silence, I stood up. I'm going to take everything back. I'm taking the house, the money, and I'm going to make sure you and Braxton pay for what you've done. If you think this is going to end with some apology or an explanation, you're wrong. The only thing I want from you is for you to stay out of my life. Caitlin didn't say anything as I walked away. I knew she wouldn't fight me. Deep down, she knew I was right, but it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. I had a plan, and it was already in motion. The next few days were a whirlwind. I contacted a lawyer, started gathering evidence, and made sure I had everything I needed to move forward with the divorce. Braxton might have thought he was in control, but he had no idea what I had planned. I could feel the walls closing in on him. The lies he had built his world on were crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. One night, as I was going through the paperwork for the house they had bought with my money, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. Braxton had been hiding something else from me. Not only had he been funneling money into a new house with Caitlin, but he had also been making deals with other people, using my name and my money to fund his schemes. I couldn't believe it. Every trust I had ever had in him was shattered beyond repair. I had made up my mind. This wasn't just about getting out of a bad marriage anymore. This was about taking back control of my life, about exposing the people who had used me and treated me like I was nothing. I reached out to a private investigator to help me track the money, the transactions, and the lies. With every new discovery, my resolve grew stronger. I wasn't going to let Braxton walk away with everything. He had to face the consequences, and I was going to make sure of it. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I found out about the way Braxton had lied to his company, creating false sick days to cover his tracks. The truth was out, and I had everything I needed to destroy him. But the best part, I wasn't going to just take him to court. I was going to make sure the whole world knew who Braxton and Caitlin really were. They had underestimated me. Now it was time to turn the tables. With everything lined up, I made my final decision. I was done being the victim. I was going to take back what was mine and leave Braxton and Caitlin with nothing. The feeling of power, of reclaiming what had been stolen from me, was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my own life again. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. I had thought long and hard about how I would execute my next move. The stakes had never been higher. I wasn't just going to let Braxton and Caitlin waltz away from this mess, thinking they could erase the hurt they caused me. I had spent enough time being the dutiful wife, the silent partner, tolerating Braxton's manipulation and his mother's cruel behavior. Now it was time for them to face the consequences. The final blow came when I gathered all the evidence: recordings, text messages, bank statements, proof of everything they had been hiding. Braxton had used my hard-earned savings to buy that damn house, not just for his mother, but as a show of control. He thought he was smarter than me, thought he could keep pulling the wool over my eyes. He underestimated just how far I was willing to go. The moment I walked into that house after finding out about the house purchase, I knew this was it. I wasn't going to be the quiet wife anymore. I wasn't going to allow him to paint me as the crazy one while he waltzed through life on the back of my hard work. I stood up to him, and for the first time in years, he was taken aback. As we sat in the living room that day, Braxton and his mother looked at me with confusion written all over their faces. They expected me to be passive, to back down, but I wasn't backing down anymore. "Do you really think you can just take my money and expect me to be quiet?" I asked, my voice steady, but with a growing fire inside me. "You bought that house with my money, Braxton. You've been stealing from me and treating me like I'm some servant to your whims." His face turned pale, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't deny it. His mother, of course, didn't say a word, looking at me like I was the one in the wrong. "You really have no shame, do you?" I continued, my anger bubbling over. "The house, the lies, the money. You've been lying to me for years, and now you've dragged Caitlin into this too. How could you do this to me? How could you betray me like this?" Braxton opened his mouth to defend himself, but I wasn't interested in his excuses anymore. I had heard enough of them over the years. This time, there was no room for his justifications. "You think your actions don't have consequences, but I'm not letting this slide. I've got everything on you," I said, showing him the folder with all the documents and screenshots. "The house, the money, the fake sick days. You're going to pay for this." His eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," I replied coldly. "And don't think you can talk your way out of this. It's over, Braxton." His mother opened her mouth to argue, but I silenced her with a look. She wasn't going to manipulate me anymore. I had had enough of her interference, enough of her judgment, enough of her belittling. And that's when I made the call. I called the private investigator I had hired a few weeks earlier, telling them to prepare everything for the next step. It was time to expose Braxton for who he really was. I wasn't going to be the victim in this story anymore. Within hours, I was sitting with my lawyer, preparing to file for divorce, and to make sure Braxton would pay for everything he had done to me. The amount of money he had stolen from me, his lies, his manipulation, it was all coming to light. But there was one thing I hadn't accounted for. Caitlin, of course. She didn't know I had everything documented. She didn't know I had a backup plan, but she was about to find out. I reached out to Caitlin, setting up a meeting. She arrived looking sheepish, like she was hoping for some kind of redemption. But she wasn't getting that from me, not after everything. Zephyr, I'm sorry, Caitlin started, her voice cracking. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt you. Save it, I snapped. You think an apology is going to fix this? You think I can just forget everything you've done? You betrayed me. You were never my friend. You've been using me to get ahead, and now you'll pay the price for it. She looked at me with pleading eyes. I didn't know what to do, Zephyr. I got caught up in it all. I was scared of losing everything. Well, now you're going to lose everything, I said, my voice hard. You and Braxton, you both think you can get away with this, but you won't. I'll make sure of it. The guilt was written all over her face, but I didn't care. She wasn't my friend anymore. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. A few days later, the papers were signed. I had filed for divorce. The legal battle was going to be long and ugly, but I didn't care. I was ready to fight for my rights, for the life I had worked so hard to build. As I stood in the courthouse, signing the final papers, I couldn't help but feel a sense of release. The weight of years of lies, manipulation, and betrayal was finally being lifted from my shoulders. But the best part? Braxton and Caitlin were going to have to face the consequences of their actions. They were going to have to explain everything in front of a judge. They were going to lose everything they had taken from me, and that was just the beginning. I walked away from the courthouse, feeling free for the first time in years. My future was mine again, and I was going to make sure it was better than anything Braxton and Caitlin could ever have imagined. The weight of the last few months seemed to lift as I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. It was hard to believe it had all come to this point. I had been pushed, manipulated, and betrayed for so long. But now, for the first time in years, I was standing tall, finally free from the chains that Braxton and Caitlin had wrapped around me. The divorce was final, and the papers had been filed. Braxton's world was crashing down. His lies had been exposed, and now, all the wealth he had tried to build on the backs of others, especially me, was slipping through his fingers. He wasn't going to get away with this. I wasn't going to let him. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a rush of emotions: relief, triumph, and yes, even a bit of satisfaction. For years I had been his doormat, tolerating everything just to keep the peace. But now it was over. The game was up. And for the first time, I felt like I had control over my own life. I didn't even have to look at Braxton to know that he was panicking. The look on his face when he first realized what was happening, the shock, the disbelief, told me everything. But it wasn't enough to make him change. No, it wasn't going to be that easy. I went home that night, and there was a sense of peace in the air that had been absent for far too long. The house felt different now, like I had reclaimed a piece of it, a part of myself I had forgotten existed. A few days later, the real repercussions began to hit. Braxton and Caitlin found themselves facing the fallout of their actions, not just in their personal lives, but in the public eye. The truth was out there, and there was no way to hide from it. Caitlin's involvement in the entire scheme was exposed too. She had thought she could play the victim, but no amount of manipulation was going to make her look innocent. The recordings, the messages, the evidence I had gathered over time, it all painted a clear picture of betrayal. As for Braxton, his reputation in the business world started to crumble. His company was under investigation for the fraud, the lies, and the manipulation of accounts. I could practically feel the weight of his guilt as it sunk in, and that alone made everything worth it. But it wasn't just about watching them suffer. It wasn't about revenge, not in the way they thought it was. No, this was about reclaiming my life. This was about stepping into my own power after years of being silenced. I wasn't just letting go of Braxton. I was letting go of everything he had made me feel I was. Invisible, insignificant, weak. I wasn't weak. I had survived years of emotional abuse, and now I was rebuilding my life on my own terms, and it felt incredible. A few weeks passed, and my father-in-law, the only person who had shown me any semblance of support, called me. He wanted to make sure I was doing okay. There was something in his voice, a sense of guilt and regret that I could still hear, but I wasn't holding anything against him. He had tried, in his own way, to make things right, and I appreciated that. Zephyr, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry. I know it's too late to undo everything Braxton and Caitlin did to you, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. And you don't need to worry about that house. I'll take care of the legal stuff. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from relief. I didn't have to carry the weight of this on my own anymore. Thank you, I replied softly, my voice steady but full of emotion. I'm finally free, and I'll never let anyone treat me like that again. The next few months were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. I found myself walking away from the wreckage, but with my head held high. The life I had once imagined, one filled with love, respect, and happiness, felt possible again. One day, I got a call from an old friend I hadn't heard from in years. She had heard about everything that had happened and wanted to reconnect. We met up at a cafe, and as we sat down, she said something that struck me to my core. You know, I always thought you were strong, but after everything that's happened, I realized just how powerful you are. It takes a lot of courage to walk away from something you thought was your life. Her words stayed with me. I had been strong all along. It was just that I had forgotten that strength, buried beneath the lies and manipulation. But now, I was remembering who I really was. And I was reclaiming my life, piece by piece. Braxton, on the other hand, was left to deal with the aftermath of his decisions. His relationship with Caitlin became strained, and his career, it was a shadow of what it once was. I wasn't interested in hearing about their failures anymore. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. As for me, I was no longer the woman who had been broken by Braxton's control. I was no longer the one who apologized for everything, who let others walk all over her. I had found my voice, and I was using it. I moved into a small, cozy apartment and started a new chapter of my life. I took up painting, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I reconnected with old friends. I took a trip to Paris, something I had dreamed of for years, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for spending money on myself. And at night, when I lay in bed, I felt peace. I felt free. I was finally living for myself, and that, above all, was the sweetest revenge.